Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This one really gets at what it means to fight for justice. It's one of those stories with everything. True crime, a mother's intuition, and a search for the truth that took over a year to unfold.
Yeah, it's a story that really reminds you how much we rely on the people closest to victims to help bring the truth to light. You know, they often have a perspective that official investigations might miss.
That's true, and in this case, that perspective was crucial. Back in July 2023, 29-year-old April Holt was found dead in her home in Antioch, Tennessee. The initial ruling, suicide. But for April's mother, Jamie, it just didn't feel right.
It's so powerful, that feeling a mother has for her child. Jamie just knew something wasn't right.
And it wasn't just a feeling either. Jamie noticed things that didn't make sense. Like the autopsy report mentioned bruises on April's neck, thighs, and ankles, which is pretty unusual for a suicide.
That's a really good point. If those details raised red flags for Jamie, why didn't they for the authorities? It really makes you think about how thorough these investigations are, especially when the circumstances surrounding a death are unclear.
Yeah, totally. So Jamie decided to take matters into her own hands, talking to people, piecing together information. And she uncovered some pretty unsettling stuff. Did you know that April's husband, Donovan, had pawned his wedding ring just a week before April died?
Wow, that immediately makes you think what was going on in their relationship. It definitely adds another layer of suspicion.
Right. And April had confided in her mom about wanting a divorce. Apparently, she was unhappy in the marriage.
Okay, so now we're really starting to see a different picture of their relationship.
Exactly. So armed with this new info and that gut feeling that something wasn't right, Jamie went to the authorities, but they basically dismissed her concerns. Case closed. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been?
Oh, I'm sure it was incredibly frustrating. It's something we see happen way too often. When families feel like their concerns aren't taken seriously, it begs the question, how much weight should authorities give to the people who knew the victim best?
It's a good question. But Jamie's not one to give up easily. Months went by. She kept pushing, kept investigating. And then almost a year later, there's a huge turning point.
This is where the case takes a really dramatic turn. During her own investigation, Jamie found out that Donovan's fingerprints were found on the duct tape used at the crime scene.
Wait, the fingerprints were there the whole time?
It seems that way. This really crucial piece of evidence was somehow overlooked in the initial investigation.
Wow. I bet that was a bombshell for Jamie. After months of being told she was wrong, now there's physical evidence linking Donovan to the scene. So what happened next? Did Jamie confront him?
She did. And in the most 21st century way possible, during a FaceTime call, Jamie confronts Donovan with this new evidence. And get this, he confessed. He admitted to strangling April and staging the scene to look like a suicide.
Wow, that must have been intense.
Totally. So finally, armed with this confession, Jamie convinced the Metro Nashville Police Department to reopen the case.
What about Donovan? Where was he this whole time?
He'd moved to San Antonio, Texas. Police tracked him down and arrested him in September 2024. Over a year after April's death, he was charged with reckless homicide, meaning causing death through reckless actions, as well as evidence tampering and false reporting.
It's crazy that it took so long and so much effort from Jamie to get to this point. What a whirlwind of emotions that must have been for her, to finally see him arrested, but knowing it wouldn't bring her daughter back.
Absolutely. It makes you think about how much families have to do to get justice in these cases. It shouldn't have to take a mother becoming a detective to get justice for her child.
Okay, so Donovan is arrested and charged. Did he go straight to trial?
He did, and the trial was pretty complex. The prosecution had a ton of evidence. The bruises on April's body, the pawned wedding ring, April wanting a divorce, and of course that confession. But a confession doesn't always mean a conviction.
Right. The defense can still try to dismantle the prosecution's case. What was their strategy? Did they just deny everything?
Actually, they took a different route. Instead of denying everything, they tried to argue that April's death was an accident, a tragic outcome of something consensual that went wrong. They claimed Donovan panicked after her death and staged the scene out of fear.
Wow. So basically trying to minimize his actions and make it seem like a terrible mistake, not a deliberate act. But what about all the other evidence? The bruises, the ring, April wanting a divorce. That doesn't exactly fit with an accidental death.
You're right. And the prosecution made sure to highlight those inconsistencies. They brought in witnesses who talked about the couple's troubled relationship, trying to establish a pattern of behavior that suggested a motive.
So these two very different stories are being presented. A tragic accident versus something way more sinister. That jury had a lot to unpack.
They did. And in a surprising turn of events, Donovan decided to take the stand.
Really? That's risky.
It is. It seems he wanted to express remorse, to try and convince the jury he never meant to hurt April. But his testimony didn't really seem to land. It felt rehearsed. And it didn't address the inconsistencies.
So the jury heard everything. Arguments, testimony. What was the verdict?
They found Donovan guilty, but not of all the charges. Guilty of reckless homicide and evidence tampering, but not false reporting.
So they believed he was responsible for her death, but not that it was premeditated.
Right. And this is where it gets interesting. The judge sentenced Donovan to 25 years, which is a long time. But for Jamie, it wasn't enough. She was sure April's death was planned, and she wanted to see him held fully accountable.
This is wild. So what happened next? Did Jamie just accept the verdict?
Not at all. She took her grief and frustration and turned it into action. She started working with organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and became very vocal about the need for stronger laws to protect victims.
It's so inspiring to see that, taking such a horrible situation and turning it into something positive. She didn't just want justice for April. She wanted to prevent other families from going through the same thing.
Absolutely. Her story shows that even with immense loss, we can find the strength to make a real difference.
So what happened next? Did her advocacy work have any impact?
It did, but to understand the impact, we need to look at what happened after the trial.
Okay, let's do that. Tell me more about what Jamie did and the changes she fought for. We left off with Jamie feeling like that verdict didn't really represent what happened, that Donovan hadn't been held accountable for what she believed was premeditated. Where did she go from there? I mean, it can't be easy to keep fighting with all that grief.
It's remarkable, isn't it? Jamie's dedication to April. Even after all that, she could have just accepted the verdict. But she knew in her heart this wasn't just recklessness, that April's death was planned.
You mentioned that she started working with those organizations focused on domestic violence. What was that like?
She dove right in, connecting with groups in the Nashville area, sharing April's story, talking about the warning signs she had missed, and advocating for victims.
I bet that was tough.
Wrong?
To keep reliving that pain. But I can also see how it could be empowering to channel that pain into positive change.
Exactly. And Jamie wasn't just focused on the past. She was fighting for the future. She was really passionate about harsher penalties for domestic violence.
You hear that term domestic violence all the time, but it's hard to really understand it unless you've been through it. Did Jamie talk about what that was like for April? The abuse?
She did, and it's chilling. Donovan was very controlling, isolating April from friends and family, monitoring her phone, even dictating how she dressed. He'd put her down constantly, make her doubt herself. Classic emotional abuse.
It's just heartbreaking. It reminds you that abuse isn't always physical. Those emotional scars can run so deep.
Absolutely, and those emotional wounds make it that much harder to leave. When you've been manipulated and controlled for so long, you start to believe you deserve it, or that you can't escape.
So Jamie's sharing April's story, advocating for tougher laws, working with these organizations. Did any of it actually lead to change?
It did. Her work and the attention she brought to the case led to some significant changes.
Really? Like what kind of changes?
Well, for one, Tennessee lawmakers introduced a bill named after April's Law. It would increase penalties for domestic violence, especially in cases where strangulation was involved. Strangulation is often a sign of things to come, even more violence.
That makes sense. It's so dangerous.
Yeah.
And can have lasting effects on the victim.
Yeah.
So April's Law was meant to address that specifically.
Exactly. Recognizing how serious strangulation is and holding abusers more accountable.
Did it pass?
It's still going through the process. There's some opposition, of course. But the fact that it's even being considered is a real testament to Jamie's hard work. And the awareness she's raised.
That's incredible. That her tragedy could lead to a law.
To protect others.
It really speaks to her strength.
It does, and her work didn't stop there. She also pushed for changes within the Metro Nashville Police Department.
What kind of changes?
Well, you remember how Donovan's fingerprints were missed at first? That raised some big questions about the investigation. Jamie used that as an opportunity to advocate for better training, specifically for recognizing domestic violence and doing more thorough investigations.
So she was basically saying, this could have been prevented if the police had been more careful.
Exactly. And you know what? Her efforts actually led to new protocols, things like mandatory domestic violence training for all officers, stricter rules for evidence gathering, and an approach that puts the victim first.
It sounds like she really made a difference.
She did, and her impact went beyond just policy changes. She changed the community's attitude towards domestic violence.
How so?
April's case got people talking. They started talking about domestic violence more openly, realizing that it can happen to anyone. It was like a collective wake-up call.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yes, exactly. And Jamie was leading the charge, encouraging people to speak up, support victims, and demand change.
She became a symbol of hope.
She did. And her story shows us that we all have a role to play in this.
To prevent domestic violence.
We need to be aware of the signs, believe victims, and make sure abusers are held accountable.
So we've talked about her advocacy work, the changes she made, her impact on the community. But what about Jamie herself? How did she cope with losing her daughter while also fighting for justice?
That's a question that speaks to her resilience, and it's an important part of her story.
It's really amazing what Jamie was able to do with all that grief. But I keep thinking about how hard it must have been for her personally. How do you even begin to process that kind of loss while also trying to change the world?
It's a tough question. You have this incredible grief, this hole in your life, but also this need to fight for justice, to make sure your loved one's death wasn't for nothing.
Did Jamie ever talk about how she managed those emotions? How did she keep going when it would have been so easy to just give up?
She did. She talked about finding strength in April's memory, using that grief to fuel her advocacy work, almost like she was channeling April's spirit, her energy, her love for life into this fight.
So it wasn't just about getting back at Donovan. It was about making sure April's story had a positive impact.
Right. And Jamie also found comfort in connecting with other families who had lost someone to domestic violence. She talked about how powerful it was to share that grief, to know she wasn't alone.
It makes sense, knowing you're part of a community, even in those dark moments.
It's incredibly healing. It can give you the strength to keep going.
So she had April's memory, the support of other families, and her advocacy work. But what about just the day-to-day stuff? She was a single mother raising April's kids. How did she manage all of that?
Well, it couldn't have been easy. But she had a really strong support system, family and friends, and the community she'd built through her advocacy work. They all helped out with childcare, gave her emotional support, and encouraged her to keep fighting.
It's a good reminder that we all need help sometimes, especially when facing such huge challenges.
It is. Jamie's story shows how important community is, having people you can rely on, people who believe in you.
So as we wrap up this case, what are the biggest takeaways? What can we learn from Jamie and April's story?
There are so many, but if I had to pick a few. First, trust a mother's intuition. Jamie knew something was wrong. She refused to accept the easy answer, and that's what led to the truth.
That makes sense.
Second, listen to victims, believe them. We need to create a space where people feel safe coming forward, where their stories are heard and taken seriously.
That's so important.
Third, domestic violence can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter your age, your race, your income. We need to be aware of the signs and willing to speak up if we see something.
And lastly,
never give up on fighting for justice. Jamie's story shows us what one person can do, even when it feels impossible.
it's a really powerful message of hope.
It is. It shows that even in the darkest times, we can find strength, resilience, and make a real difference.
As we finish up this deep dive, I think it's important to leave our listeners with a question.
What will you do to prevent domestic violence? To support victims? To create a world where justice is served?
It's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next time with another story, another chance to learn and reflect, and maybe even change the world